From their inception, Votann's been wielding problematic rules which dwarfed the scale of power. Their problematic rules saw them banned at tournaments, even before release. GW issued an errata along with an apology video that claimed it was all an accident. In this video, I'll go over all the mechanical problems with the Leagues of Votann, and demonstrate that despite their FAQs and erratas, Votann have problems which persist. GW wants you to take their word that the problems are rectified. They're not. Let's start with the top layer of this cake, that being that the Leagues of Votann are an army of exceptions. Now, as I've stated in the past, Warhammer 40k is a game of core rules over which army rules rest, and often provide exceptions to that core layer. In this regard, the issue with Votann is contextual, and to clarify that context, let's define what I qualify as
the tiers of exception.
An army ability that allows you to advance 3 plus D3 instead of D6, like High Fleet Kraken's subfaction rule, is a potent exception. But it doesn't affect the functionality of the opposing player. We can consider this a Category 1 level of exception, as it's providing an exception to the core rules of the game. In contrast, an ability which forces wound rolls of 1, 2, and 3 to always fail, like the Space Marines' transhuman physiology stratagem, is also a potent exception, but it's one which directly affects the functionality of the opposing player. Attacks chosen based on their high probability of success now hinge far more on luck. Because this is now affecting the enemy player's interaction with the core rules, we can consider these types of mechanics as a Category 2 level of exception. And thankfully, these types of mechanics are for the most part limited in their application. But further still, an ability which denies enemy units from using their invulnerable saves, such as Be'lakor's Blade of Shadow's Piercing Strike, is undoubtedly a potent exception, which denies the target from using their abilities. These kinds of exceptions are by far the most exceptional, as they are outright denying tools which the opposing player has typically paid for with points of one form or another. We can consider these types of mechanics as a Category 3 level of exception. This unit does X, until the enemy player brings their own unit that says no it doesn't. These types of rules generally have the most potential to be distasteful, but again, they're usually limited in their application. Case in point, characters with magic swords. So in review, Category 1 are rules which provide exceptions to core rules that don't involve the enemy player. Category 2 are rules which provide exceptions which do affect how the enemy player interacts with the core rules of the game. And Category 3 are rules which deny the enemy player from using the exceptions they have at their disposal. Now, to illustrate the claim, let's do a quick assessment of Votann's rules. Under army-wide abilities, we have Steady Advance. Units can ignore Move, Advance, or Charge modifiers, both a Category 1 and 2 exception. And when advancing, they always move flat 3. Accelerated keyword units go flat 6. This is Category 1. Void Armor results in opponents not being able to reroll their wound or damage rolls. That's 2 Category 3s. And enemy AP is reduced by 1, which is Category 2. Next, Eye of the Ancestors. Votann's army-wide ability to auto-wound based on tokens accumulated on enemy units, at minimum on 6s and at best on 4s. This can be considered a Category 3 exception, since it ignores the toughness of enemies, and denies defensive tools like -1 to wound from use, and circumvents the ordinarily potent value of transhuman-style abilities. Looking at their unique weapon types, we got Magna Rail weapons, which ignore invulnerable saves, Category 3, and can cause excess damage to spill over to other models, Category 2. Beam weapons make attacks using a line between the firing model and the target unit, which also make attacks against all units the line passes through. This in itself is a Category 2 exception, since it's affecting the opposing player. Though, those attacks auto-hit those intervening units, which is a Category 3 exception because those attacks weren't declared against those intervening units. Reactive defensive tools are unable to be used, not on the hit test or on the wound test, as those reactive defensive tools are often worded with use this when declared as a target of an attack. And further still, additional hits scored by beam weapons for attacking a target further away also trigger additional wound rolls against intervening units, even if they are not beyond the required threshold themselves. It's a Category 3 wrapped in a Category 2, which triggers more Category 2s. And in the miscellaneous category we got Bikers which are OBSEC, Category 1, a 1 command point stratagem allowing their troops to shoot back at a judged unit, Category 2, a 1 command point stratagem allowing any unit to gain full rerolls against a judged unit. This is a Category 2 that is better than the status quo. A stratagem for their Psyker to nullify enemy debuffs and ensure they are unable to be debuffed until the next command phase, Category 3. An easy to cast psychic power which provides 1 command point, and specifically has an exception to stack, where every single other instance of rules providing armies additional command points doesn't have this affordance. It's a hefty Category 1, and where every other Master Repair character restores 3, their Master Repair unit repairs flat 4, which is often the perfect number to ensure you're always shifting up 1 bracket. It's a Category 1 that's better than the status quo. The list speaks for itself, and I'm willing to bet there's probably a few I'm missing. I think it's interesting to compare this evaluation with another faction infamous for their exceptions, the Harlequins, who also happen to be considered very competitive. And you can note that while Harlequins are a faction where janky exception-oriented rules would harmonize with their fluff, being agents of the Laughing God and all that, Votann have a higher exception score. All of this exceptionalism feeds into the crux of the mechanical issue for the Leagues of Votann, which is that they are designed to be great. This is likely in an effort to push new product into an ecosystem which is already cemented in a power creep pay-to-win cycle, a sentiment which may be unsurprising to some. And while the exceptions we've explored thus far feed into this notion, from a design point of view we can see that the Leagues of Votann were designed to be great at winning the game. Note that this is different than just having potent rules. Just take a look at Eye of the Ancestors. As I've already illustrated, auto-wounding targets on hit rolls of 6 to 4 is already a very strong ability to have access to across an army. This is tempered based on those targets having judgment tokens. But take note on how those are dealt out. These are collectively all comeback mechanisms. Judgment tokens are dealt out when an enemy unit destroys a Votann unit. So now the entirety of the Votann army will have an easier time destroying a unit which destroyed any Votann unit. Which sounds business as usual, but this is extremely desirable for the types of units available to many armies, which reliably delete units, and are typically harder to crack. Secondly, judgment tokens are dealt out when an enemy unit completes an action or psychic action. And since completing actions is often tied to scoring objectives, those units are likely ones you wish to destroy, which now all Votann units will have an easier time doing. This also comedically kicks in when a completely out of sight enemy unit raises a banner in a ruin on the other corner of the map. And thirdly, at the end of the opponent's turn you can select a unit within range of an objective marker to gain 1 judgment token. This one is the most obvious. Since controlling primary objectives is of primary importance, this is a tool which will help all Votann units destroy a unit which would be used by the enemy to score in their next command phase. And we can also mention in the Votann player's command phase, their Cowl, their primary HQ choice, can throw a judgment token to a single enemy unit which is visible. Suffice to say, nearly any unit you are going to want judgment tokens on will get them. It's all in service to help you win the game, which sounds like it could be said about any dynamic army-wide system, but in the case of Votann, it's literally tempered around how points are scored. Contrast that to every other faction's dynamic army-wide systems, which are far more open in their application, and offer buffs which are often less potent. What makes this all the more egregious is that the Eye of the Ancestor's ability is always on. What do I mean by this? Well, it doesn't change battle round to battle round like Doctrines, Wontons, Imperatives, or Karates. And unlike other systems which are always on, there is no luck to the mechanic, like with Miracle Dice, Fate Dice, Luck Dice, or Warp Storm Dice. Eye of the Ancestors is always on, and always works. and doesn't expire.
Wow, that does not sound right.
In addition to the structural superiority of Votann's dynamic army-wide rules, there also seems to be something suspicious with how Votann are positioned. Now is a useful time to make use of my old attribute chart. Votann are characterized as a faction which has slow movement, but make up for it with their toughness. They are also high-tech, and specialize in shooting, being very efficient and lacking flexibility. They are essentially the science fiction version of the fantasy dwarven engineer archetype. Naturally, this would lend one to believe their weaknesses as an army would be their low speed, their lack of flexibility, and melee combat. But when you look at their suite of tools, that isn't the case at all. Your weakness is that you're supposed to be slow. Well, here's Steady Advance, helping you shore up your slow movement with reliable movement increases when you advance. Need more speed? Here's a Fast Attack Biker unit, which claims to be slower than normal bikes at 12 inches versus 14. But they have a pre-game move to move their full distance, have the fly keyword despite clearly being a hover vehicle, and a stratagem to make their advances 24 inches, which is great since they're also objective secure. Still not fast enough? Need more flexibility? Here, have a teleportation war gear upgrade for the units which would typically be your slowest. And what of your melee weaknesses? Well, here's an HQ character that can be tooled up into a brick shit house. Here's a combat dedicated elite choice where each model can make 6 damage 1 attacks at strength 5 AP 3 that have a 5 up feel no pain, 4 up against damage 1 attacks, that can reroll their charge rolls and can fight on death if they're charged. Not enough melee dominance? Here's a strat for that unit to reroll all hit rolls. Works well with judgment tokens. And here's a stratagem to heroically intervene with an infantry or biker unit. Does the enemy keep tagging you in melee and you want to shoot? Here's a stratagem to fall back and shoot with core units. Need some good melee relics? Here's one to force an enemy to fight last. And while I am sure there are more I missed, I think my point has been made. Attributes which would typically be a weakness for Votann have been shored up. Now, that in itself isn't inherently a problem, as there is another faction which is similarly situated. A faction which is renowned for their tough armor and superior war gear. A faction which is capable of excelling in nearly every area barring psychic dominance. A faction which is defined by being superior to the human standard and their ability to annihilate their foes. Which leads into the problem lurking below the surface. What is, in my eyes, the most significant issue with the Leagues of Votann. In an effort to make their new faction a hyper-efficient contender with loads of exceptional rules, Games Workshop has made Votann into an army which undercuts the flagship faction of their own IP. Space Marines and their heretical cousins are the elite power fantasy factions of the setting. This is absolute. And you might be thinking, hey, what about the Eldar? They are also a superior elite deadly faction which also has classic roots in 40k. Surely it isn't an issue for Votann to be positioned similarly. While Eldar can be classified performing at parity and even exceeding Space Marines in certain areas, like mobility and flexibility, they fall short in areas like durability and physical output. However, Votann skew into similar areas Space Marines do, which not only hurts both factions' area of specialty, but additionally Votann do not have a comparative shortcoming like with the Eldar. Now naysayers might claim, what about Custodes? Don't we already have a faction which is already better than Space Marines? The answer is twofold. In lore, Custodes are essentially demigods and are categorically superior to the vast majority of beings in the setting, and so thematically, they can scrape by being better than the elite Space Marines, as Custodes are the elite of the elite. And secondly, on the tabletop, the Custodes have their shortcomings. As for all their superiority, they lack board presence and extensive tools for dealing damage at range. In essence, the Votann skew into every area Space Marines do, but they do it better. A point of comparison is the face of each army, their premier troops unit. Here's a breakdown with each unit at their default size loaded with their ideal gear. Things have been arranged where comparisons can be made, and I've highlighted in green where exclusive advantages exist. And you can see that the Hearthkin far outcompetes the Intercessors in offensive output, though the Intercessors have a few attacks less in melee, with a few of those being comparatively more lethal. But then you factor in the Hearthkin's metapack, and Comms Array for enhanced resilience and reliability, and you start factoring in the army-wide rules for each army, the disparity begins to worsen. The Hearthkin are just better, hence why they cost more. And yes, while this is a 5-man unit with 5 guns versus a 10-man unit with 10 guns, the fact of the matter is, these are the units at their default size. And while one could argue that model per model the Space Marines are more elite, as far as their units are concerned, the Hearthkin are superior. This outshining on Votann's part is hard to reconcile. Space Marines are Angels of Death. Thematically, they are a military force without comparison, and so it's strange to see Votann exceed them in all the areas they excel. And I'll acknowledge that this is a game about armies, and so what we see here when looking at the Leagues of Votann's range is their military expression. But for Space Marines, there is no other aspect. There is only their service as humanity's Angels of Death. So why is it they're being outdone? The only logical conclusion, which I hesitate to say, is that the Leagues of Votann are better at being Space Marines than Space Marines. Well, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this dissection on the Leagues of Votann. In summary, while the Leagues of Votann have obvious differences in their stats and abilities, there is a clear overlap with Space Marines in the attributes they specialize in. And if a faction is going to outperform Space Marines in certain attributes, they ought to underperform in other ones, as failing to do so, at best, results in the dilution of Space Marines as the mighty power fantasy faction they have always been, or at worst, outright dethrones them. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons, Julius Maximus, as well as the others who help keep the dream alive. Anyways, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing, so press the buttons you want to press, and I'll catch you in the next one.